Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we are going to be discussing something that's actually a bit different to what I normally do on this channel, which is considering the kinds of analyses that we can make of a translated text, because it is something that I personally quite oppose within the field of classics and medieval studies, just all the sort of historical analyses, where for the most part, people today seem to have the idea that it is an acceptable and maybe just like useful enough method to make historical analyses based on a translated text. So you'll see people writing arguments based on a translation of Beowulf or The Wanderer, Virgil's Aeneid, whatever you want. And I personally really object to this. I think that there's a lot that gets lost in translation, but that's a topic for a different video. It's sort of an unfortunate reality that most students and most of the general public who are going to be interested in the medieval past will either at the beginning of their journey or just throughout their journey of researching about the past be using translated text. And to some extent, this is understandable. It took me about 10 years to get to a point where I could read Latin sufficiently to just read Ovid's Metamorphoses as an example and take it in. That's a massive investment of time and money to a large extent as well, an opportunity cost, and it would be a bit unreasonable to, I guess, to tell people that they can't interact with the past at all, they can't read medieval ancient texts at all, and people are still going to be curious and they're still going to want explanations about these kind of things. And I think it's no coincidence as well that some of the most popular historical YouTubers like Jackson Crawford, Simon Roper, etc., Scorpio Martianus, these kinds of channels, oftentimes what they do, if they're not like, Scorpio Martianus plays around a bit more with Latin, but what, say, Jackson Crawford does is he essentially tells you what's in the translated text, and being an expert himself, he can sort of inform the lay public of some things that they may not have known to look out for in the text, but he's primarily giving them information about Old Norse in English, right? He is also providing resources which enable a person to learn Old Norse, and I hope and try to do the same thing on my channel, because the reason I gave you an analyzed text in the original is that I want to make the process of reading medieval text in the original as easy as it's plausibly possible to do. And that's why with my color glasses, I generally find that students who are learning one of these languages, if they have the aid of a gloss, they can read a text in the original, which they wouldn't have really been able to manage reading if they didn't have that gloss to hand and all they had was a grammar and a glossary. But those channels that do give viewers text and information in English, they're much more successful, and I think it's entirely valid. But this leads, I think, in public discussion about these kinds of texts, and particularly within undergraduate education, to students doing analyses based on texts which have been translated, and very often this can lead to pitfalls. And the advice as an undergraduate teacher teaching students on a module for medieval literature where they're reading text in translation, what I advise students to do personally is simply to avoid making certain kinds of arguments which are based on information which is rather easily lost in translation, and instead to make other kinds of literary analyses which don't really matter that much whether you're basing it on a translated text or the original language version. And that's the question I'm going to consider in this video, is what kinds of things can we actually and reliably understand from a medieval text if we're only reading it in a translated version? And to help guide us through thinking about this, I'm actually going to draw on an archaeological theory which was promulgated by Christopher Hawkes, and this is known as the ladder of archaeological inference. Now, caveat that there's some controversy around this theory, there are arguments against it, etc., and there's a lot of nuance that really should be gone into here, but for the simple purpose of a sort of conceptual framework to help us think about kinds of information which may be more or less accessible given different kinds of data, I think that this is still a useful model. So essentially, what Christopher Hawkes' ladder of archaeological inference is getting us to consider is what kinds of information we can, with confidence, know about cultures for which we only have an archaeological record. We don't have a literary historical record, and we don't have a folklore record. And the relationship of folklore to archaeology is pretty controversial in and of itself, and I think that sort of anti-colonialist movements within archaeology often overemphasize the extent to which folkloric traditions are likely to be authoritative. For instance, many Native American folklore mythologies would sort of describe these tribes coming out of the soil of America itself, being created within America itself, when we know from genealogical and archaeological and linguistic evidence that Native Americans came over, I believe, via Siberia through a land bridge that existed way back in the past. So I'm not completely sold on the folklore thing, at least not in all cases. There are some cases where it's very useful. But for cultures, say the Dorset culture in Greenland, where we don't have any folklore tradition or historical record, all we have is the archaeological record, Hawkes is asking the question, how much can we actually know about this society with confidence? And fortunately, in archaeology, we have societies which are historical, so we have an archaeological record for them, and we have a historical record for at least some of them. So the Anglo-Saxons might be a good example. We have texts that were written by them both in Latin and in Old English. We have texts that were written about them at the same time period by outsiders. We have archaeological records from them, etc., etc. And to some extent, we have folklore records as well. And then we have cultures which are more peri-historical, which is where other cultures have written about them, but we don't have records of them from themselves, or we don't have substantial records of them from themselves. The Celts are maybe a good example of this within the context of the Roman Empire, or the Druids in Britain. And then we have completely ahistorical societies. And we can compare different, I guess, analyses of the two. We can compare archaeological analyses of Anglo-Saxon societies and say, well, how much do we rely on the written texts, as an example, to understand and interpret Anglo-Saxon artifacts? And this ladder of inference is meant to be a guide to help us think through that. And it's essentially an ascending ladder of difficulty. So the first rung are things which we can most reliably, most confidently understand about artifacts and the society that produced them. And then the fourth rung is what Hawkes is arguing is difficult or even impossible to actually, with confidence, ascertain from artifacts. And so the first rung, which is he's saying we can usually argue this with confidence based on purely archaeological evidence, are the materials and methods by which given artifacts are produced. And I'm going to be using swords here as an example because my background is in medieval martial arts. This one here is British Museum collection number 19890701.1. It's a replica of the Sutton Hoo pattern welded sword, because of course the beautiful pattern welding on the original has now been lost. So we can see that here, and I'll be flipping back to that as an example, as a reference example. So with the first rung of Hawkes's ladder of archaeological inference, let's hypothetically say that we dug this up from Sutton Hoo grave and it was as well preserved as this, it wasn't rusted at all. Christopher Hawkes would argue that the first rung, the sort of materials and the productions which produce this sword, we can identify with quite a lot of confidence. And so we can analyze the steel and say this is made of steel. We can analyze the chemical processes by which it was produced, and because those chemical processes in the present day will produce the same outcome, we can say it must have undergone certain kinds of tempering in order to produce this pattern on the sword. And so we can know this with some degree of certainty, I would say. And then the second rung is the economic system in which said artifacts were employed. Now, this sword on its own, if we were to have this sword donated to a museum, and let's say we were to know with confidence that it was authentic and it wasn't fake, but we had no provenance, we had no fine context, we had nothing like this, we couldn't necessarily know much about the second rung, like the economic system it's in, because we can only really start to tell that when we have this sword in conjunction with other items. So given that this one came from Sutton Hoo, We could look at the other items that were buried in the Sutton Hoo grave and say, well, these are extremely expensive items in the context of the time. They have lots of objects which cross-culturally are quite likely to be considered valuable because, for instance, they're shiny. So gems are going to be considered valuable in pretty much every culture around the world, regardless of their aesthetic tastes. And we can also look at the context of archaeology, contemporary archaeology from the same time period. So we can look at the coins that are buried in Sutton Hoo, and we can say, well, these coins are rarely found in other Anglo-Saxon burial deposits. So it's likely that whoever was able to assemble all of this had a lot of political power and possibly prestige as well. So that second run, that economic system, we can identify to some extent, particularly, for instance, in Sutton Hoo, we have coins that come from far away from the Byzantine Empire. We have materials that come from India, for instance, and this indicates some degree of trade networks. It indicates that whoever was buried here, or their family burying them, could have some kind of access to material that's imported from abroad, right? Because let's say, I'm forgetting the specific stones, but let's say the rubies that were brought over and buried in Sutton Hoo, if they don't occur naturally in Britain, it would be impossible, right, for them to be there unless there was some kind of trade access. So we can identify some sort of broad stroke information about the economic system which this Sutton Hoo sword moved around within from the material analyses and the archaeological records alone. So we've not used any kind of text or literary reference to understand this. This is purely based on archaeology. So if literally every word of literature produced in early medieval England was suddenly lost to time, we would still be able to know this about Sutton Hoo. The third rung is more complicated and harder to make arguments of because the economics we can know. The political system, however, is harder and more difficult because now what we've been analysing hitherto has been wealth. We've been talking about, well, this Sutton Hoo sword is an expensive object which would have taken a lot of resources at the time to have, and we can identify this based on how rare these things are and how likely they are to be found in association with other expensive items, right, and other valuable items. But expense doesn't always necessarily correlate one-to-one with status, and the Anglo-Saxon world is actually maybe a very interesting example of this. Clergy, for instance, might have an extremely expensive burial. St. Cuthbert's tomb, for example, was very expensive in its wood carvings, in the items he was buried with, etc. But it would be a mistake to infer from this that clergy had power. Now, they had power, but it wasn't political power in quite the same way. If we were to find Cuthbert's tomb and we were to know nothing about the languages he spoke, the literature, and the world in which he lived, the religion that he had, the Christian religion, we might find St. Cuthbert's tomb and think, oh, this was the tomb of a mighty king. And look, we can tell this because he's buried with all these expensive things. And only somebody with the political power of a king who was leading a people into maybe battles to acquire these things in conflict would be able to obtain these treasures. And we know with the case of St. Cuthbert and clergy that that's not true, that clergy in the Middle Ages weren't, for the most part, engaging in battles, and they weren't wielding political power in quite the same way because they were removed from the world, right? They were non-secular. And so this third rung is where we can maybe identify some broad strokes, but things are starting to break down a bit. Like what I was talking about earlier, right? About how hitherto I've been talking about the sword in the context of economics. And economics overlaps with politics and power to some extent, but it doesn't go all the way, right? A person buried with a lot of expensive stuff probably had a great deal of political power, but we don't know the specifics of how it worked and what it meant in the context of that society necessarily, unless we have written texts to accompany that. And finally, the very fourth rung, which is what Christopher Hawkes argues is very difficult to actually understand, and that's the religious or symbolic meanings that some artifacts had. So if we dug this sword out of the ground, we couldn't really say that this sword was associated with so-and-so deity, let's say Odin, as a hypothetical. I know that Odin is associated with spears, but let's say as a hypothetical, because we don't have any written text to tell us that Odin is associated with spears. Let's say maybe we have a folklore tradition in England that says that Odin or Woden or whatever was a god in the past. Hawkes is arguing we couldn't reliably say that this sword is associated with that deity, that it had associations with even masculinity or with certain kinds of social classes. We couldn't necessarily know that, or with certain kinds of geographic locations, like swords being found in association with trees or whatever. It would be rather difficult to make those assertions with confidence. And there are some things that we could, like if swords are often found in rivers, that we can tell that there was some kind of association, right? But we don't know precisely how to interpret that relationship. If this sword was found bent and thrown in a river, as is often the case for swords in early medieval England, that could be interpreted as an offering to spirits that live in the river. It could be interpreted as laying a sort of boundary to the river. It could be interpreted as a threat to those same spirits of the water. If there even are spirits of the water, it could be an offering to the water itself. So we really can't know with a lot of this fourth ring stuff anything with certainty without a written record. So that's the Christopher Hawkes's ladder of archaeological evidence in a nutshell, in the broad strokes. It's essentially saying that we can, if we have an archaeological record only, we can know some things about a past society, but we can't know other things with certainty. Now, let's apply this similar sort of concept, just the idea that if we have only one kind of data about the past, there are going to be some things we can know with confidence and other things we can't really assert very well. And apply that same topic to a translated text. So here I have on the screen a color-coded gloss of lines 1443A to 1466B of Beowulf, and we have a excerpt from the Leslie Hall translation of these same lines. And I just chose this one because it's public domain, and you'll probably identify that it is maybe not the easiest to read because the language is 100 years old, even in English, but it's good enough and it's free, so you can't complain. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read this out, and then for these italicized portions, these are areas where I'm going to compare back to the original Old English and say what we can infer with certainty about it and what has been lost in translation. And then at the end, we're going to consider the kinds of arguments that we can make based on this. Okay, so a rare instance from me in which you're going to have me reading a translation of Beowulf rather than translating it for you. But here we are. This is Leslie Hall's translation. Beowulf donned then his battle equipments, cared little for life. Inlaid and most ample, the hand-woven corselet which would cover his body must the wave-deeps explore. That war might be powerless to harm the great hero, and the hating one's grasp might not peril his safety. His head was protected by the light-flashing helmet that should mix with the bottoms, trying the eddies, treasure emblazoned, circled with jewels, as in seasons long past the weaponsmith worked it, and wondrously made it, with swine bodies fashioned it, that thenceforward no longer brand might bite it, and battle-sword hurt it. And that was not the least of helpers in prowess. He has Unferth's sword in his hand, that Hrothgar's spokesman had lent him when he straightened, and the hilted hand-sword was Hrunting entitled, old and most excellent amongst all of the treasures. Its blade was of iron, blotted with poison, hardened with gore. It failed not in battle any hero under heaven in hand who it brandished, who ventured to take the terrible journeys the battlefield sought, not to the earliest occasion that deeds of daring 'twas destined to accomplish. Okay, so pretty cool scene. This is Beowulf, I believe, gearing himself up for the fight with Grendel's mother. Now, let's have a look at some of these specifics and think about what we can identify with confidence and what we can't identify with confidence. So, Beowulf donned then his battle equipments. Now, this word here, battle equipments, if somebody who is reading Beowulf and maybe doing a video analysis of Beowulf using only a translation, they might assume from this context that this is referring only to sort of specific gear that's made for battle, so his armor and his weapons. Now, this is technically what's true here, but the word itself, eoriowadum, sort of just means, an earl's clothing, an earl's garments. It doesn't necessarily mean specifically battle equipment. This is a very sort of petty point, I suppose, but it's, a quick example. And then we have the handwoven corset, which would cover his body, must the wave deeps explore. Now, this wave deeps is translating sund, which, yes, is true. Like, sund in this case is probably rather well translated as the wave deeps, the sea, the water, etc. But there's a lot that's being missed here in that this word also means, can refer to swimming and just sort of swimming contests out at sea. And there are other instances where the word sund is used, which this is hearkening back to. So in chapter, I believe, 8 or 9, I believe it's 8, Hunferth's speech, and I've done a video on this, which is something like Beowulf's toxic masculinity, if you search on my channel. In chapter 8, where Hunferth attacks Beowulf for essentially risking his and Brecca's life in a swimming contest, he says that, they went out on the Sund, they went out onto the sea. So there is an extent to which the repetition of this word here is hearkening back to that, right? So in chapter 8, Hunferth describes a swimming contest between Beowulf and Brecca on the sea. And in the same ways, that is almost like a foreshadowing of Beowulf's fight with Grendel's mother, which is going to be going on later here, and the repetition of this word is going to be harkening back to that. So there's a parallel being drawn here between chapter 8, the contest with Brecca, and the fight with Grendel's mother, and in a translation, because they might use an entirely different word in that case, because there's many different ways that you could translate sund. You can translate it as the wave deeps, the sea, etc., and especially if the translator is trying to make the poem alliterate or rhyme in a verse translation, you might not have the same word that's being used. So if in chapter 8, Leslie Hall has also translated the word sund as wave deeps, then you could maybe remember that association, but you can't reliably know that that's going to be the case. And you can't know with confidence that the same word actually does reflect the same word in the original. A translator could translate two different words in the Old English using the same word in modern English, which wouldn't necessarily always be the wrong choice. The word rink, for example, versus sedge. Those words, mean warrior, basically. You could translate both rink and sedge as warrior in modern English, and it would be an entirely valid translation. But they might be referring to one character exclusively as a rink, and making reference to a rink might be meant to echo, to call back to that character in a given context. And you couldn't know that from a translation because you would only see the word warrior for both rink and sedge, so you wouldn't be able to identify that relationship there. And a similar thing here, we're not able to identify that this word sund here is being used to refer back to the context with Brecca and draw a parallel there because we're using a translation. So it's not that the actual information must the wave deeps explore is wrong. It's that we don't have as much access to how it's embedded within the text of Beowulf because we're basing it on a translation. So going on, that war might be powerless to harm the great hero, and the hating one's grasp might not peril his safety. This is a really interesting one because what it is translating is this. Yes, here we are. That him Hildegrap refrene mikte erdes inwitfeng aldra ishetan. Now, what we have here is two nominatives, Hildegrap and Inwitfeng. So Hildegrap is battle grasp, so battle gripping, and Inwitfeng is a sort of hostile seizing, essentially. So both referring basically to grappling and the context of a close combat fight. Obviously referring to what Beowulf is going to be engaging in with Grendel's mother. Now, the word "and" here is, again, not necessarily wrong. It's just sort of superfluous. So Hildegrap, I would argue, is maybe somewhat more neutral in the sense that it doesn't have a necessary context of who one's fighting against. So one could be engaging in a Hildegrap against humans or against monsters or against some sort of in-between category. It's ambiguous. Whereas Inwit Feng has, because the word Inwit is sort of like wicked, bad, evil, it has some degree more of an association with an unjustified attack, because there are certain attacks in Beowulf which are framed as, these are the enemies, but they have an understandable reason to be angry. Whereas Inwit Feng, I feel, wouldn't be used in that way. And there is actually no and in this sentence. Fatim Hildegra Predra ne micht erdes Inwit Feng aldri shetan. And in such contexts like that, what it means is that if you have two nominatives but a singular verb, so in this case michte is singular, this sort of implies an overlap between the two, or a sort of equivocation of the two. So the poet here is equating the threat of a battle grasping to his soul or to his safety, and it's comparing a sort of malicious grasping harming his life as exactly the same thing. And that subtlety is lost in the translation. We can't know this because they put the word and in, so it frames as if it's two different things here. And I mean, likewise, when it says might not peril his safety, the Leslie Hall has repeated that here. War might be powerless to harm the great foe, and the hating one's grasp might not peril his safety. Peril his safety isn't really in here. There's no word for safety. There's no word for in danger or in peril. It's saying the battle grasp may not damage his sort of well-being, his soul, and then the hating one's sort of malicious grasping may not damage his life or harm his life. So there is an equivalency between the two here, which is being ignored or like overseen because we're working on a translation. But again, the actual things that are happening, we are identifying with accuracy here. So moving on to the next bit, which I thought was bad. Now notice what we've got here, and I haven't really put any italicized things where we've lost a lot in translation. His head was protected by the light flashing helmet that should mix with the bottoms. This is describing the quality of the helmet and the sort of actions it does. Not that much is going to go wrong there. Trying the eddies, treasure emblazoned, encircled with jewels. Again, encircled with jewels. A bit like Hawkes is saying with the archaeological ladder of inference. We can look at a crown that we dig up from the soil and say, this has a lot of jewels on it. Jewels are expensive. And there's only so many ways you can mistranslate jewels. There are ways that you could that might imply that it's something else, but unless a translator is completely incompetent, they're not going to get that kind of stuff wrong. Nouns tend to have more of a one-to-one equivalence, right? The word for a ruby or a sapphire is going to be, there is going to be a word in Old English for that, whereas there's many conceptual words, like maybe weird as an example in Old English, which is often translated as fate, where we don't have a good one-to-one equivalent word in other languages which contain all of the same meanings. But the word for sapphire or ruby in Old English is going to contain all of those same meanings, probably. May contain the same cultural associations because sapphires and rubies may have been used in different contexts back then, but the word sapphire is going to refer to the rock, which is, what color is a sapphire again? Blue? Let's say it's blue. The word sapphire is going to refer to that blue shiny rock in Old English and in Latin and in modern English. There's not so much that's going to be lost in translation there. So similar to the archaeological ladder of inference, we're going to get that correct. But now on to the next bit where I actually do have some issue with the translation, which is this one. That thenceforward no longer brand might bite it and battle sword hurt it. So this is another one where, like above with Hildegrap and Inwit Feng, it's actually two nominatives, but there's no and there. It's like neither brand nor battle swords, bitan nemerton, would be able to bite. So it's exactly the same action that both the brand and the battle swords are engaging in here. But Leslie Hall has added in and battle sword hurt it, probably to fit in with the lines that he's got there. And somebody who's doing an analysis of this might read this line, hurt it, and say, oh, well, because in the poem it's referring to the helmet, I believe. Yeah, the helmet, which is protecting Beowulf's head, being hurt by a battle sword. This is implying that the helmet is alive, that it can feel pain, that it's more of a person. And all of that analysis would be completely unfounded because the word hurt it is not actually there. It's just a sort of translation device that's been added in by Leslie Hall to make it flow better. Which again is not a bad choice on Leslie Hall's part, but it does mean that we can't reliably know that. And that's a big problem with translation, is that you might see a word like this, an insertion like this on the part of the translator, which could completely change how you're interpreting a given thing, or maybe just change the finer details of your interpretation. And you'd have no way of knowing whether it's in the original or not. Sometimes that's actually what modern scholars try to fix with facing page translations, like the Loeb Classics Library. Part of the reason they put the facing page translation there is so that scholars doing essays on classics, working primarily from an English text, they will at least have the Latin or Greek on the other side of the same page, so they can quickly look and see, well, is there an equivalent for hurt it in the Greek or the Latin, which they should be able to identify if they've done doing classics. And that avoids them falling into that trap. So, facing page translations are probably the best if you have to use a translated text rather than reading it in the original language, because you wouldn't fall prey to this kind of thing. But if you're only reading a translated text, then you're going to be vulnerable to not knowing which words in the translation are added in information on the part of the translator rather than the actual original composer of the text that you're analysing. So moving on to the next bit, another addition here. He has Unverd's sword in his hand. So that is between, that was not the least of helpers in prowess, and Hrothgar's spokesman had lent him. And up here in the Old English, it's Nasthat thona matost mayan fultuma. So that was not the least of helpers in prowess. Not a terrible translation here. He has Unverd's sword in hand is not there. So we go straight from Mayan Fultuma, which is of helpers in prowess, all the way down to that him on Therafalach Thilla Hrothgar's, that Hrothgar's sort of servant or spokesman lent him in his need. And there's no reference to it being Unverd's sword. The reason that Leslie Hall has put this in there is because this hunting was given to Beowulf by Hunferth earlier on, but it's not in the original. So somebody who's analysing this might sort of do a sort of analysis of saying, by mentioning that it was Hunferth's sword, the poet is implying that Hunferth is almost like metaphorically there and helping Beowulf to get equipped, and therefore giving Hunferth some degree of credit for Beowulf's victory, as an example of the kind of argument that somebody might make if they're only reading a translation of Beowulf. That would be unfounded because Unferth's sword in his hand is an addition by the translator and is not in the original here. And in fact, we could even say that the fact that Unferth is not mentioned by name here, he's simply mentioned as Hrothgar's spokesman, right, or Hrothgar's announcer, servant kind of thing. That actually is downplaying Unferth's contribution here, but we couldn't know that if we were only looking at the translation. And then moving on to the next thing that I've highlighted here, Hrunting failed not in battle, any hero under heaven, in hand who it brandished. Now, so this use of the word brandish here, I think in Victorian English it could have a broader meaning of like wielding or holding, but I think in modern English, for sure, when we think of the word brandish, we imagine it as you are shaking a weapon at somebody in a threatening manner, right? Like Twitch, for instance, you can hold a firearm on Twitch nowadays, but apparently you can't brandish it, and that means like pointing it at the camera as if you're going to shoot it or shoot someone else, So we have a distinction with that word brandished, and somebody reading the translation might read this as referring to somebody brandishing the sword as a threat to somebody else, so they might think that it only refers to somebody, or that this protection, that it doesn't fail anyone who brandishes it, only applies to somebody who's wielding the sword in a threatening manner in battle. But the word is actually hit mid mundum bewand. He sort of enfolds it with his hands. And interesting, by the way, that it's hands here, plural, and not singular, given that we know at this time that, I don't actually have a picture of a hilt here to show you, but just take my word for it that swords from early medieval England and from Iron Age Scandinavia, which is where this is set, the poem of Beowulf, they ubiquitously have grips which are only large enough really for you to put one hand around. So the reference to it being held by two hands is a very interesting one. It's unclear what it could mean, but it invites other kinds of considerations, right? So if it's impractical to hold the sword in two hands, and it doesn't Neswak mana an anyum tharthe hit mid wand, it failed none of the men who held it with their hands. What kind of other interpretations does this invite? It could mean that it was held up with two hands in ceremonies, and we do have reference to, for instance, to, I believe, Welchtheo bringing a sword through, processing it through Heorot during one of the feasts. And so this could be a reference, if she might have held it in both of her hands while walking around with it. So that could be a usage which is being intended here or referenced here by the reference to the sword being held in two hands, right? The poet might have been intending for us to hearken back to when Welchtheo held a sword in two hands. I think it might even have been Fronting that she held in two hands as she carried it around the hall of Heorot, rather than Beowulf brandishing the sword in the context of battle. But that is the only meaning that we're going to get if we're looking at this translation, that it failed not in battle any hero under heaven in hand who it brandished. And very quickly, actually, also, this under heaven is also not mentioned here. In battle is mentioned, that Hilda. And then, so probably under heaven is actually translating mana, so of the men. And so it's not wrong. It's sort of saying that, of humans, and humans do live under heaven, at least those of us who don't manage to get into heaven. But it might, somebody again might say, well, this is making reference to heaven, and so there's a Christian context going on here, blah blah blah. And that would be another insertion which misleads somebody who's doing an analysis of Beowulf only based on the translation. So on to the last one, which is, again, somewhat of a petty point. Nas that forma sith that hit Ellen Werk Afnan Skalda, which Leslie Hall has translated it as, not the earliest occasion that deeds of daring 'twas destined to accomplish. Now, most of this is not wrong. I don't have an issue with this. I have an issue with this word destined to accomplish here, because that's not what's being used here. Like, literally, I would translate this as, it was not the first time that it being Fronting, had to accomplish Ellenwerk, sort of deeds of courage, courageous deeds. So I think calling it destined here, somebody might be reading this and be like, oh, this is harkening back to the Anglo-Saxon concept of weird or fate, and it's saying that swords have a destiny and their destiny is to draw blood. But is that actually the case? I mean, we've certainly got swords being used in Beowulf for things other than drawing blood in ritual processions. And so, again, if we read too much into the use of specific words in a translation, we might be going very far astray in our understanding of the symbolic properties that swords have within Beowulf and within the context of Anglo-Saxon society that's listening to the text of Beowulf, and even in Iron Age heroic society, which this poem is referring to the deeds of. So there we go. Those are some of the things which, if you are only reading Leslie Hall's translation of Beowulf, you might be mistaken on. Now, some of these things that I have highlighted here, could they be fixed with a more scholarly, more informed translation? Absolutely. So the blotted with poison mistake, I don't think a modern scholar would probably make that mistake of translating Arteratanum as blotted with poison. I think they would have gotten that as veins. But one quick thing also is that this actually is me relying on what's actually a printed edition. I've not actually gone and looked at the place in the manuscript of Beowulf where it says it. And sometimes there are spelling variants that different transcriptions of a given text disagree in. So it's possible that the original place in the manuscript actually, maybe it's unclear, or maybe it should be an O, in which case it could well be poison blotted. Or alternatively, it could be that this E is a dialectical variant or an archaic variant, because we do know that there are archaic linguistic forms attested in Beowulf. It's one of the parts of the arguments for Beowulf being one of the older poems in Old English. So it's possible that Arter is just an older form of the West Saxon Arthor, and therefore it should actually be translated as poison branched, or with poison branches. So even here, this original is still contested, and that's why what are called critical editions, which contrast different manuscript variants of a text, are so important. And I'll do videos in the future about critical editions of texts and how they're compiled, etc. Although in the case of Beowulf, it's a hapax legomenon, hapax. Anyway, it's attested in a single manuscript, the Noel Codex. So we have no issue about variants in a different manuscript, but it's possible that different scholars might have a different reading of the manuscript. They might say that actually it is Arthortanum, and therefore Leslie's translation is correct. So there's still debate even within that could be had. But my point being that I think a modern scholar, if it actually does say Arteratanum, would translate it differently. Same thing one could argue with this battle equipment here. Somebody could translate Eoyawadum in a different manner, etc., etc. But many of these things here, I think, are difficult to avoid, in part because some of them, if you were to fix them, would actually be kind of difficult. So with this one here, thenceforth no longer brand my bite it and battlesword hurt it. So I've highlighted this hurt it here because these are extra words that are added in and they aren't actually in the text, which is true because the words are battlesword hurt it. Here we are. Bitan ne merton, and that applies to both the brand and to the battle swords. But how would that work if we weren't to say hurt it, right? Thenceforth no longer brand my bite it and battle sword? Or would we say and battle sword might no longer bite it? That would be a lot of unnecessary repetition, which would make the text in translation quite longer, and that repetition in itself might lead some students to misinterpret it because they might say, oh, well, they're repeating the biting aspect of it to emphasize its importance, which isn't necessarily the case. So it's a compromise situation, and you're never going to be able to get a translation which fully encapsulates what's being said in the original, although I would concede that you can get a translation that's going to drastically reduce the amount of misunderstanding that you get from a text. And so, as I would always tell my students who are, well, in next semester I'm going to be teaching students who are probably going to be, some of them, writing essays on Beowulf, I would tell them just make the kinds of arguments that aren't going to be lost in translation and where the basics of it are probably going to be the same. So to conclude, what kind of analyses can we actually do with confidence when we're reading a medieval text in translation? So I would say we can identify associations of nouns for the most part. So if swords occur frequently in a certain text during scenes of a particular character, there was likely some kind of symbolic association between the two. And so in this context here, right, when the sword, I should say, fronting is referenced, there are some things it's referenced in relation to, right? So it's described in relation to iron, and you're not going to get that wrong, right? It's an iron one. We have the reference to blood here. That's going to be the same regardless, swata. we have the references to it being used in battle, etc., etc. And we have also the reference to terrible journeys and the dangerous places. So those kinds of concepts, no matter how they're translated, are probably going to be pretty much the same. So we can say that the sword is associated with iron, with battle, with dangerous places, etc., foreign lands, and also that the sword is capable of performing deeds of courage, right? So that we can say with confidence regardless of how it's translated for the most part. We can also analyse the broad actions that a character does, because the details which get lost in translation tend to be the finer ones. So, for instance, there's almost no way of translating Beowulf where somebody could read the translation and think that Grendel is alive at the end. They also couldn't think that Beowulf is alive at the end because he explicitly dies and is buried or put out to sea. But you know what I mean. So, looking at this case with the sword here, right? That Hrothgar's spokesman had lent him when straightened. There is no way that one could either read this or translate this, which would sort of not communicate that Beowulf was given Hrunting by somebody else. So at a minimum, that indicates certain kinds of things, right? That Beowulf isn't bringing this sword to Heorot himself, that there might be some symbolic importance about being supplied weapons that come from the surrounding area when he's fighting monsters that are plaguing said local area. All of those kinds of analyses somebody could do purely from a translation and still be accurate. And lastly, we can observe the broad strokes of political organisation within the societies treated in a translated text, so the power dynamics will still be quite obvious. So I don't know if we can necessarily identify too much about the power dynamics going on here. We could perhaps identify the fact that this particular sword is named when other swords aren't, marks it out as significant. We could maybe talk about the fact that Hrothgar's spokesman lends Beowulf this sword being a reference to, some kind of gift giving as a key social phenomenon within the medieval society. So we can identify some of these broad strokes just from this sample alone, whether we're doing it in the original or based on a translation. Although, again, the finer details of that economic relationship are still going to be tied up in the specific words that are used in the Old English original. And as I've said, when analysing this earlier, all of these analyses depend on your text being translated accurately rather than misleadingly. And so there we go. That's it. Those are the kinds of things that we can actually, with confidence, identify. I hope it's been made clear when we're working from a translated text. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I know it was a bit long. If you would like me to teach you how to read the original Beowulf yourself by teaching you Old English, you can subscribe to my Patreon, where I offer lower than market tuition rates for certain tiers of patrons, and thank you so much to my 3 patrons that I currently have. You can also join my Discord server. I have a dedicated channel now for learning Old English, and I also tend to post my glosses as pictures before I turn them into videos, so you can get early access to them there. And as usual, like, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye, everyone.